Hi, welcome to session 10 of History 3380, World Civilizations. Now, in the last session, what we were looking at is one aspect of the process of modernization as it unfolded in two different situations. One was countries which modernized roughly around the same time as other Western societies, namely Germany and, of course, then the Asian example of Japan, but did so in fairly conservative environments, fairly socially repressive environments. And we saw that lead to fascism. And then the examples of countries that tried to rapidly modernize, particularly using foreign capital, Russia and China, and how that led to revolutionary outcomes. Again, societies with a fairly repressive systems, especially in the treatment of the peasantry, and in struggling with those issues, autocratic states that tried to modernize and use foreign capital to speed the process up set off a whole series of unwelcome consequences, at least for them, in terms of anger of the peasantry over the loss of land, discontented proletarian groups or working class groups, and also animosity towards foreigners who were often blamed for the rapid changes that were taking place in these societies. And as a result, we get communism, which still offered to achieve modernization and achieve the material results of an industrial society, but would do so supposedly within the context of a workers' paradise, where there would be guaranteed jobs and retirement and education. And even the case of China, where Mao dreamed of creating a society in which people's basic ways of thinking would change, that they would be less self-centered, they would be more community-oriented, although as we saw at the end of the last session, that did not prove to be the case. And China in the last 3 decades has taken a course geared towards really state capitalism and has gradually been dismantling this state system of education and workers' benefits that was created under Mao. Today, what we're looking at is another aspect of modernization, but in this case, we have the direct imposition of control by Westerners on foreign societies, on non-Western countries. In other words, imperialism. We saw this happening in the earlier session. We saw the imposition of this direct control in places like Africa and Asia. Now what we're going to look at, much as we've looked at the reactions to modernization in societies that were either already modernized or trying to rapidly modernize, now we're going to look at it from the perspective of people who had this sort of forced upon them in the forms of colonialism, and how they responded to that and what the outcomes were. We're going to look at situations such as those in Africa and Vietnam, the Middle East, China, and I'm sorry, not China, but in Africa and the Middle East and India, and see how these people responded and what kinds of societies they tried to create as they fought back against this variation on modernization, which involved the imposition of direct control over their lives and over their cultures. Now, what would happen is that the old imperial or colonial empires would collapse in relatively rapid fashion between about 1947 and, if we stretch it a bit, the mid-1990s. And we have to stretch it because, in many ways, South Africa fit really the model of a colonial society, but its liberation wouldn't come until the 1990s. But most of the places that we would count traditionally as colonies of Europe achieved liberation sometime between 1947 and the end of the 1970s, with some exceptions like South Africa. How this collapse came about is one of the things we're going to look at today. And if we go to the first slide, I've made a list of things that trigger this process in terms of why the decline of empire occurred beginning in the middle of the 20th century. One simple reason was that the European powers threw themselves into two suicidal conflicts that we call the World Wars, I and II, and did enormous damage to each other in terms of their economies and their military institutions. Sandwiched in between the World Wars was the Great Depression, which devastated the industrialized economies of the world. And in particular, it really pushed England into a situation where it truly no longer could claim to be one of the really dominant economic powers of the world. England found itself, after fighting the First World War and then being struck by the Great Depression, really struggling to maintain its position in the world. It was a seriously weakened economic empire by the end of the Great Depression. A third factor that had only tangential relationship to what was going on in Europe was the rise of resistance in the colonies themselves, people organizing to try to get rid of colonialism. Now, there is a relationship to Europe in the sense that many of the people that led the resistance movements were trained in European educational institutions. Remember, the European powers, as one mechanism of control, had wanted to train a small portion of the population in their colonies, educate them to become the bureaucrats who would help administer the system. And this is exactly what they did. But these European trained elites, although most of them would become loyal bureaucrats, they also learned a good deal about Western culture and Western political ideas. Ideas that we've talked about here, such as popular sovereignty, the rights of the individual, forms of representative government. And of course, these elites learned very clearly that the systems created by the imperial powers in places like Africa and India hardly squared with the ideals of Western society in terms of the rights to representation, individual rights, etc. And this became a powerful ideological weapon that these European trained elites could focus against the Europeans. It was a powerful argument as to why imperialism was unjust, why it was simply wrong. There was also a growing audience for these ideas of resistance in Africa, India, and elsewhere, because the two world wars in particular helped stimulate enormous demand for products being produced in these societies, raw materials. So it was oil, rubber, all kinds of materials that had to feed the war machines of Europe. Coming at a time when many Europeans had been drawn home to help fight the wars, this created opportunities for people in Africa, India, and elsewhere to enter the economic system as entrepreneurs and to take a larger share in the running of their own societies. So we have an emerging middle class, and one that is growing in size significantly by the 1940s. And these are people who have the time and the education to identify with many of the ideas that the European educated elite is talking about. So all of these factors will help contribute to the decline of empire. Now, in terms of organized resistance, a series of political movements emerged in the colonial world that focused on the question of empire. In India, for example, the founding of the Indian National Congress in 1885. In South Africa, the African National Congress in 1912. And of course, in Ghana, the Convention People's Party in 1948. Something important to note about the first two in particular is that when they're created, their stated purpose was not to topple the imperial system. It's doubtful they would have survived for very long with that as their stated purpose. Mostly what the leaders of these movements wanted was to try to achieve some degree of reform of the imperial system, to improve conditions for the populations in the colonial system, and to gain at least some greater voice for the local population in the governance of the colonies. Furthermore, these movements, at least the first two, were not really political parties when they were first created. They were more intellectual gatherings of a relatively small group of educated people who discussed these ideas, published pamphlets critical of the imperial system, etc. But over time, as we will see, and we'll see this in India, starting with the Indian National Congress, they would evolve and become mass-based political parties, which would give them much of the power that they needed to move beyond just critiquing the imperial system to actually demanding and finally achieving full independence. So this is an evolutionary process that occurs. These early organizations are not from the outset committed to all-out independence. Now, India, one might have thought, would be perhaps the last colony that the British would ever surrender. It was termed the jewel in the British colonial crown. It was so important as both a market for British textiles and other manufactured goods, and a vitally important source of raw materials such as cotton in order to feed the economy of Great Britain. But in fact, it would be the first British colony, and they were really the first European colony to achieve independence. Part of this the British managed to do to themselves, unintentionally. Railroads, while they were intended to move products out to the ports and to move troops around to help maintain colonial control, also tied the people of India together in a very real and physical way that they never could have been linked before. Given the very rough geography of India, it was very difficult for people to move over long distances. But now those distances and the ease of traversing them were tremendously improved by the railroad. People could now get a real sense of each other's existence. People could now meet face to face to talk about common concerns. Even more pervasive in their influence were newspapers. The British, of course, first started printing newspapers in English, but very quickly Indian entrepreneurs began developing local newspapers, and these, even more than the railroads, helped spread a common sense of identity. How does one conceive of other people in this vast community that is India? Well, one very effective way is to read about them. You can find out what's going on hundreds and thousands of miles away from you and get a sense of common identity with people, common shared concerns and problems. So both railroads and newspapers actually helped accelerate the process of developing an Indian national identity. Now, a key policy of the British had been commercialization of agriculture. But throughout the 19th and into the first half of the 20th century, until independence, the main British concern was with agriculture as an export industry. And that meant that in many occasions, the kinds of things that were being grown, produced, were not in line with domestic needs. India needs food. It doesn't need all that much cotton. But of course, what the British are interested in promoting is growing cotton, jute, and other agricultural commercial products to feed their industries. It was not unusual for food shortages to develop in India, in part because of these policies, because the first priority in agriculture, commercialized agriculture, was for export, not for meeting domestic needs. Furthermore, the system that the British had created of establishing large landed estates geared towards export production had meant a rapid loss of land for millions of Indian peasants. And this has created increased unrest in the 19th and 20th centuries in India as people saw their land, their means of sustenance, being taken from them. As the absolute rulers of India, the British had absolute responsibility for problems such as famine and disease. And there was never a more telling condemnation of British rule in India than the influenza epidemic after World War I that may have killed as many as 20 million people in India. And we never know if that's an accurate figure. It at least is in the order of reality. And of course, who is ultimately responsible for this? Well, it's the government. And the government is the British imperial government. So this further antagonizes the local population, and of course this kind of anger is pervasive across the social orders because people all across India, from rich to the poorest, are suffering from the spread of influenza. It's in this environment that the Indian National Congress is formed in 1885. But again, in its early history, it was largely a debating society, a group of well-to-do business people, intellectuals, white-collar people who talked about and issued public statements about the problems of colonialism in India. However, a new dynamism entered the Indian National Congress with Mohandas Gandhi. Gandhi had spent much of his early adult life in South Africa, where, of course, not only were Africans discriminated against, but Indians as well. There was a large population from the Indian subcontinent living in South Africa, and they too had to experience severe discrimination. As an attorney, Gandhi used his legal skills to fight against that discrimination. For example, suing the railroad companies in South Africa for having separate cars for Africans and for Indians as opposed to white people. Gandhi is one of these Western-trained intellectuals, and he is inspired in part by the ideas of Henry David Thoreau in his essay on civil disobedience. The idea that those who have been denied any real access to power and who are being exploited have a right to challenge that exploitation through civil disobedience. In other words, by disobeying the law. Because if they have no voice in creating or running the system, then the system has no legitimacy for them. And they have a right to take those actions that will correct these injustices, civil disobedience. And that became a central premise of Gandhi's movement. In India, Gandhi puts these ideas to good use with boycotts of British goods, strikes by Indian workers in British mines and factories, mass marches, demonstrations. All of these are illegal, so they're all forms of civil disobedience. But they are ways of expressing the discontent of the local population, which has been denied other legitimate forms of expression, such as being able to vote in elections. Another important premise of Gandhi's thought was nonviolence. The idea that, yes, there should be civil disobedience, but it should not be in violent form. And he did not intend the boycotts, strikes, or marches to be violent, but simply to be various ways of expressing discontent without taking up arms. Now, there was a very practical reason why Gandhi adhered so closely to the principles of nonviolence. It wasn't just some philosophical commitment, oh, sounds nice, this is good. Gandhi is well aware that Indian society is deeply divided by the caste system. From the superior castes, such as the Brahmins, all the way down to those who are basically excluded even from the caste system itself, the untouchables. There is deep-seated unrest among the peasantry in rural India. And Gandhi knows that in trying to organize resistance to the British, in trying to achieve a mass movement that would lead to the expulsion of the British, there is a real risk that people will use this as an opportunity to attack not only the British, but well-to-do Indians as well. That this easily could become a social revolution, a rebellion from the bottom up. And of course, if there is the danger of that, it means that the elites will have nothing to do with the independence movement. So nonviolence was a way of guaranteeing the elite that this was a safe political movement in which to participate. Gandhi also sought broader public support by taking a stand in regards to the untouchables. That he found the very idea of untouchables, people who were totally excluded from society, treated as outright pariahs, unacceptable. And that was an important moment as well in terms of reaching out and broadening the base of the Indian National Congress and its movement. What's happening under Gandhi, although he's not the only one doing this, but he is the key figure. What's happening under Gandhi is that the Indian National Congress is moving from being a debating society, a group of political dissidents, into becoming a mass movement, and one that isn't just calling for reform of the colonial system, but demanding outright independence. Gandhi is unleashing the power of mass politics. There was no way that a handful of dissidents in the Indian National Congress, or even tens of thousands of people, or even Indians taking up arms, were going to manage to dislodge the British. But if millions of Indians rose up and refused to obey the system, that was almost going to be impossible for the British to control. They could conceivably make the colony ungovernable, and in that way use the power of their numbers to bring an end to colonialism. One of the other principles of Gandhi's movement that I've got listed on the next slide is the idea of Swadeshi, meaning of our country, meaning taking pride once again in what is authentically Indian. Again, one of the driving principles of colonialism was the idea that the West is inherently superior. You know, why are we here? Because we have to be here, because you people are inferior. You have an inferior culture, whether it's material or intellectual. You need us. You need our railroads, you need our factories, etc. You need our textiles, even though you have plenty of textiles. They're not as good as what we do. Can't be produced as cheaply. This idea was to counter that thought process, which was common in colonial areas around the world, and even other non-colonized areas, that, well, whatever is produced here locally is inferior. You know, you want good stuff, you got to go to the Europeans. They have the good stuff. We're experiencing something like that now. You want to buy a good car, you got to go to the Japanese. You don't want to buy an American car. Well, think of that as a pervasive thought process throughout a society, that there's nothing that we produce or nothing that we've created that's really better than what they have. Well, he's trying to reverse that thought process and say, look, we need to take pride in our achievements. You know, the British didn't build the Taj Mahal. They didn't write the Rig Veda. Now, the British use a variety of mechanisms to try to counter the Indian National Congress and the general movement for independence. One is to try to take advantage of the fact that, of course, India is not exclusively Hindu, even though the Indian National Congress is essentially a Hindu movement. A substantial portion of the population is Muslim. And the British want to emphasize those differences as a strategy of divide and conquer. One of the things they do in 1905, they partition Bengal, the northeastern portion of India, specifically to break it up into Hindu and Islamic areas, emphasizing the differences between these two cultures and religions. Meanwhile, Gandhi goes on stressing the idea of Swadeshi, or national pride. Boycotts are specifically designed to deal with this issue. Particularly telling was a boycott against British textiles, a logical boycott because India had long been a major producer of very fine textiles until the British had essentially swamped them with cheap textiles from England. As a result of the boycott, British exports to India in terms of textiles fell by 25%. So these proved to be effective mechanisms both in giving people a sense of pride, but also in hurting the British. This is real economic pain. The British, in turn, aside from trying to continue to drive a wedge between Hindus and Muslims, would resort periodically to outright armed force. A crackdown in 1919, for example, that led to British troops opening fire on political demonstrators at Amritsar, which killed 400. Coming at this moment because Britain, of course, was falling back in exhaustion from World War I. Flu epidemic and famine had struck India. This was a time of considerable tumult in India, and the British felt compelled to use force in order to try to hold on and suppress these uprisings, looking towards what they hoped would be a more stable future where they could retain power. Gandhi, meanwhile, went on organizing mass demonstrations designed to not only raise self-consciousness in India, but also to stress the idea of self-sufficiency. In 1930, he organized what was called the March to the Sea, which hundreds of thousands of people joined in a march to the seashore, which might sound like just a day at the beach. Their purpose was to collect salt, the salt beds along the ocean front. The reason? One of the ways that the British imperial system supported itself in India was by selling salt and controlling salt through a national salt monopoly. So Gandhi's fighting back. He's challenging the monopoly. He's saying, look, we'll go get our own salt. We're not going to be dependent upon this monopoly that helps pay for our enslavement. At the same time, however, there are serious problems in terms of the move towards independence. There are very real differences between Hindus and Muslims in the Indian subcontinent. The Muslim population had now developed its own organization under Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the All India Muslim League. Muslims were less adamant about immediate independence than were the Hindus, for a very practical reason. They were the minority. And as much as they might resent British imperialism, they also had to be concerned about, well, what would an independent India look like if, in fact, we're the minority? Would we be treated well by the Hindu majority? So they're less anxious, and the British can play on this fear that, well, look at, sure, independence might come, but what's going to happen to you folks? You're going to be the minority here. Nevertheless, over time, Muslims would come to press for independence as ardently as the Hindus. Another strategy that the British used, besides divide and conquer, periodic repression, was to try to make concessions to the independence movement, to say, well, look, you can't have real independence, but we can certainly give you greater self-government. The Government of India Act in 1935 called for local control of domestic affairs. In other words, as long as this doesn't involve the international economy, doesn't involve the military, which is seen as international, or international relations, we can give you more control over things like decisions about the development of roads and railroads and that sort of thing, collecting of local taxes. So you'll have more control. But of course, it's not real independence. This did little to satisfy those groups pressing for independence. And when World War II broke out, Indians went on demanding, in fact now insisting, on immediate independence. They knew the British were stretched to their limits, fighting this war on two fronts, in both the Pacific and in Europe. And they felt this was an opportune time. Some went even further and formed an armed resistance movement called the Indian National Army, which gained assistance from the Japanese. The Japanese are looking to extend their influence in Asia. And one of the ways they have done that is by encouraging nationalist movements in the various European colonies in Asia. So the Indian National Army was an ideal opportunity for the Japanese to provide support to this group in the hopes that it would further weaken the British. So clearly, with the outbreak of World War II, if anything, feelings have intensified. The Indians are unwilling to accept the idea that British rule is going to continue indefinitely at the very least, is going to have to wait till the end of the war before things can be resolved. Winston Churchill offered an expanded form of self-government to the Indians. The Indian National Congress responded with a "Quit India Now" resolution. I mean, get out now, tomorrow. But of course, Churchill, a dyed-in-the-wool imperialist, had no intention of letting India go. But in the aftermath of the Second World War, with Europe and especially England further weakened, with its military severely damaged, the British finally concede independence in 1947. Why? Because they had to, basically. They simply could not control the situation any longer. This wasn't a matter of, well, gee, maybe the Indians are right. It was a matter of practicality. The mobilizations have continued and expanded, and the British have grown weaker in the meantime as a result of the war. But independence will also mean partition into two separate states. India, which consisted of most of the Indian subcontinent, bracketed on either side by the new nation of Pakistan, which of course represented the Islamic population, although millions of Muslims remained in India itself. And soon after independence, Gandhi himself is assassinated by Hindu nationalists who believe that he has been too lenient in his treatment of the Muslim population. So as much as nationalism, this sense of self-identity, was a powerful tool in helping to end colonialism, it could also become a highly destructive tool as it came to symbolize the divisions between Hindus and Muslims. And even down to today, fundamental differences and animosity continue to exist between Pakistan and India. The most striking aspect of India's independence is the amazingly non-violent fashion in which it was achieved. But that non-violence in itself had a price. The purpose of non-violence, practically speaking, was to ensure that class conflict wouldn't erupt in the middle of the struggle for independence. That issue was put aside. But it also meant that the drastic inequalities between rich and poor in India were not going to be addressed. Even though India would pursue basically a social and economic policy of socialism after independence, and for some 3 decades, there remained enormous gaps between the rich and the poor. Even today, as India rapidly becomes one of the most dynamic economies in the world, we see tremendous disparities between those who have found a place in the new globalizing economy and the millions of poor in the countryside and in the urban centers. The other legacy is that of colonialism itself. India would struggle for decades to overcome the economic legacies of colonialism. In other words, an economy that was deliberately shaped to be a source of primary product exports, particularly agricultural goods. India would struggle to industrialize in the decades after independence, and then, of course, to enter the new world economy by developing a variety of high-tech industries in recent decades. But it was a long and difficult struggle. At the same time, India also inherited a good deal of British culture, as much as it retained its own. The essential form of government in India today, for example, is a parliamentary form of government that was handed down directly from the British, as were other traditions and prevalence of English as a second language. These elements of colonialism that have been incorporated and become part of the new reality that is India. And this also says something in general, as we get further towards the end of the course, about how cultures evolve and adapt. Cultures don't exist in sort of rarefied atmospheres, only occasionally colliding with each other and slightly affecting each other. And cultures aren't ever entirely authentic. In other words, every culture is an amalgamation of past influences and experiences. India had been invaded, occupied, settled by a variety of groups from the time of the Indus River civilizations to the coming of the Aryans, the Mughals, and then the British. And all of these cultures are a part of what India is today. And as we look around the world, as we get further into looking at the globalized world, this is true of virtually every society today. That every society, every culture is, to some degree or other, more than others, an amalgamation. And that when people amalgamate, what they do is they take much of what was theirs, the culture that they inherited from their ancestors, and add to it new ideas, new influences, and make it their own. It's never exactly the same. Indian parliamentary government is by no means identical to British. They modify it, they adjust it, and they change it. India is one example of a process we're going to look at more closely in the closing weeks. The other case we're going to look at today is a very different one in terms of how independence is achieved. Because here, independence comes through violent revolution. Vietnam, in Southeast Asia, had a long history of resistance to foreign domination. Throughout most of its pre-modern history, it faced control from China, either direct occupation or in the form of a tribute-paying status where the rulers of Vietnam had to pay tribute to the emperors of China. That would create a long tradition of resistance to such foreign domination. But at the same time, just as we saw with the British a moment ago in India, it's also true that Vietnamese society came to reflect, in some ways, the characteristics of Chinese society. An all-powerful emperor, if you will. Just as in China, so too in Vietnam. A mass base of peasant populations controlling much of the land through their villages. Virtually identical to the situation in China, with the exception that actually there were fewer large landowners in Vietnam than there were in China, and far more of the land was actually under the direct control of the peasant population, who in turn replicated the practice in China of paying homage to one's ancestors. All of these clearly influences emanating from China and incorporated into Vietnam's own culture. Yet another foreign power would seek to dominate Vietnam in the 19th century. The French. Now the French came to Vietnam before the end of the 17th century. Principally missionaries and merchants seeking contact, seeking trade, hoping to achieve conversion of the population. Early Christian missionaries in particular were Jesuits, and the Jesuit strategy in their missionary efforts was to try to influence the elite. Their idea was that you go to the ruling class try to influence them, attract them to Christianity, and then the masses would follow later. So the Jesuit activities in Vietnam did not lead to any considerable conflict, even though Vietnam was primarily Buddhist, because the missionaries weren't really trying to convert the mass population at this time. And trade between Vietnam and France was sporadic, so the influences again were limited. But by the 19th century, France is set upon a course of imperial grandeur. It wants to acquire a whole series of colonies, and not only in Africa, where there is this scramble among the Europeans to seize African colonies, but in Southeast Asia. They have experience here. These are relatively small political entities, which the French believe they can subjugate. It gives the French an important outpost for all kinds of trading activities in Asia. French influence at this time in the 19th century is still mostly limited to merchants and missionaries. But missionaries now are bent on a more militant course of action, of trying to convert large numbers of Vietnamese to Christianity. Vietnamese emperors were somewhat tolerant, but increasingly the aggressiveness of the Christian missionaries became a very real concern. Because, of course, the Christians demanded exclusivity. Became a Christian, you couldn't pay homage to your ancestors anymore. That was a pagan practice. And of course, the legitimacy of the emperor is intimately tied with these ideas about ancestors and about paying homage. So this is a serious threat to stability in Vietnam. Emperor, when pushed, finally took a few of the recalcitrant missionaries and boiled them in oil to try to get a message across, really making me uncomfortable. The fate of the missionaries, in turn, triggered military attacks by the French on the grounds that they had to punish the Vietnamese for their mistreatment of the French missionaries. But of course, there's a larger purpose here. Each military expedition winds up lingering and establishing outposts in Vietnam. Furthermore, the French are able to take advantage of something that we've seen elsewhere, such as in Africa, and that is that there was considerable conflict in Vietnam among various groups vying for control of the imperial state. Very often, elite families had gone to war with each other. There was a very long history stretching back centuries of armed struggles between various dynastic claimants. The French were more than happy to involve themselves in this process, just as the Dutch had done in the Spice Islands, as a way of creating an imperial order that would be dependent upon their military might, and which eventually could be used to secure total control by the French. And indeed, by 1857, Vietnam had, for all intents and purposes, become a French colony. There's still an emperor, but the emperor answers to the French, basically a puppet emperor. So this process again of Europeans using their military might and using unrest within a target area to enhance their power and finally create total control and a colonial order. Now, one challenge for the European colonialists, wherever they went, was creating profitable colonies. It might seem logical that, well, gee, obviously they seized these colonies because they're going to make money out of them. But that wasn't that easy to do in many cases. Vietnam's economy was largely a self-sustaining peasant economy. Peasants controlled most of the land, and what they did was raise crops to feed themselves and to pay whatever tribute exactions were imposed upon them by the imperial state and by the elite. this didn't translate very well into a vibrant international economy making a lot of money. The kind of thing the French wanted in order to secure revenues to pay for their imperial administration. So the French set about doing two things, one of which we're familiar with from India, and that was to create a class of large landowners, just as the British had done in India, the French were going to do in Vietnam. In this case, it consisted particularly of well-to-do merchants, members of the imperial elite, who now would have the legal framework that would allow them to buy or simply take over large amounts of land to be turned into large-scale rice-producing estates. Large amounts of rice being produced on a commercial basis could then be exported. And the second major initiative was the development of hundreds of rubber plantations. Most of these actually controlled by the French themselves, unlike the rice estates. But both of these would generate considerable export product and help create an economy which the French could easily tax to support their own imperial structures. Another mechanism we've already seen in India, and again this repeated time and again not only in modern imperial systems but in ancient ones as well, set up monopolies. Salt. Why is salt so important? Because it helps preserve food. Nobody's got a refrigerator in 1857. Well, most people don't. How are you going to preserve food? Salt helps keep food from spoiling. So it's an essential. So that means everyone has to have salt. And if the government controls its sale, it can set the price and make a tidy profit for itself. Again, as in other colonial situations, such as in Africa, the French set about establishing educational institutions to train a small minority of the Vietnamese population, all the way from grade school up through university. In fact, some Vietnamese would go on to the Sorbonne in Paris for further studies. The purpose was, of course, to have a sufficient number of trained bureaucrats to run much of the system at far less cost than it would take to bring French bureaucrats to fill all of the posts in the colonial government. And of course, to also create enough doctors, lawyers, etc., at least to deal with the Vietnamese population. But these developments caused enormous disruption in Vietnamese society. The commercialization of agriculture, especially in the southern half of the country, was costing hundreds of thousands of peasants their land. They were losing land, which they had long controlled, which was the dominant pattern in Vietnam. Now it was in the hands of large landowners, for whom the peasants had to work. So you have growing animosity among the rural population, which represents about 90% of the population. And the fact is, there were so many Vietnamese educated at the university level that most of them couldn't find decent employment. For the French, this is good. Everything's cheap. You get lots of bureaucrats, lots of people vying for jobs. They'll take a pittance for a wage. But it also means that you've got a considerable number of people who are well educated and deeply frustrated. Add to that the long-standing nationalist tradition of Vietnam, which now comes to focus on a new external dominator, the French. And we have the makings of modern Vietnamese nationalism, articulated by a discontented middle class, but also fervently supported by the peasantry, who well know that the consequence of French colonialism has been this massive loss of land. So the French really created such disruptions in Vietnamese society that they triggered the massive rebellion that they would now face in that same society. The first widespread popular uprising came in 1930. It was not a centrally directed rebellion. Peasants throughout Vietnam began rising up against the government, attacking merchants, sacking warehouses, because they weren't getting paid anymore. The largest states, facing the Great Depression, a surplus of product, including rice, on the world markets, that meant they didn't need as many peasants. But at the same time, rice is being held off the market to keep up the price as much as possible domestically. So people are going hungry and also facing lower wages. So people became angry. They picked up pitchforks or whatever they had and went after those groups, including the local government and the merchants, whom they blamed for their tribulations. Now, in Vietnam by this time, in fact, since the early 1920s, there was a Communist Party. And it, of course, enunciated a militant vision of the future of mass revolution, toppling the capitalist colonial order. But the communists are caught unawares by this sudden, spontaneous rebellion. And they're left with a difficult choice. They can either stand by and do nothing, which they're somewhat inclined to do because they know the French have too much military force to be overthrown at this point. So it's basically a suicidal mission. But if they stand on the sidelines, then what happens to their revolutionary credentials? If these people who are the professional revolutionaries won't join in the revolution, how authentic are they? So they do go out and try to provide leadership for the peasants. And what they thought would happen did happen. French came in, cracked down, shot a lot of people, put tens of thousands of people in prison, and broke the rebellion. But it also at least gave the Communist Party in Vietnam some significant credentials, having joined the revolution, albeit belatedly. Out of this experience, two figures in particular emerged: Vo Nguyen Giap and Ho Chi Minh. Two men who had become central to the continued resistance to the French. Giap as the leader of armed resistance, the military side of it, and Ho Chi Minh as the political organizer and leader. Now, both men are communists. Ho Chi Minh had become a committed communist in the 1920s. He had visited the new Bolshevik state, Soviet Russia. But throughout his career, both before and after this adoption of communism, Ho Chi Minh was above all else a nationalist. As much as he was dedicated to communist revolution, he was even more dedicated to the basic principle that Vietnam had to be free of French domination. And that gave him, far more than his communist credentials, mass appeal in the population. As a result of the crackdown, those who survived had to go underground and operate clandestinely, including Ho Chi Minh. In fact, it was now illegal to be a member of the Communist Party, so if you tried to operate above board, you'd simply be arrested. The new communist movement and its armed wing were known as the Viet Minh. And they would begin to organize hit-and-run attacks against the French in the years after the crushing of the 1930 Peasant Rebellion. But perhaps their greatest opportunity came when, at the beginning of World War II, the Japanese occupied Vietnam. It's a French colony. Japanese are driving out the European imperialists, and that includes the occupation of Vietnam. But of course, the Vietnamese don't really care whether it's the Chinese, the French, the Japanese. They're all foreign invaders. So, not surprisingly, the Viet Minh take up arms now against the Japanese, as did other groups. It was not just the communists. There was a major nationalist movement, a nationalist party, along with the Communist Party. Both of them were resisting the Japanese occupation. In fact, it's a little bit like what was happening in China. You've got nationalists and your communists, and they're fighting each other and the Japanese at the same time. So this gives a new opportunity for the communists, in particular, to organize and develop tactics of armed resistance. And I say in particular the communists because they were better prepared for doing this. Why? Because they had been outlawed since 1930. They had had to operate underground. They had had to operate in small cells where only one person in one cell knows one person in the next cell to try to prevent the groups being rounded up by intelligence operations, etc. So they had already gotten used to operating outside the law and taking up arms. So they were already well down this road, unlike the nationalists, when the Japanese occupation occurred. So much like China, a three-sided struggle emerges. And when the Japanese are forced to withdraw in 1945 with the collapse of their larger war effort, it is the Viet Minh who march in and occupy Hanoi, the capital of Vietnam. An interesting note in all of this. In the immediate aftermath of the Japanese departure, there was a real question as to which external power was going to step in, at least temporarily, to try to establish stability in the aftermath of the Japanese withdrawal. The French were in no position to do that. Remember, the French had been occupied by the Germans for at least 5-6 years, so they weren't really ready immediately to step in. And one of the options, and one that was finally exercised, was to have the Chinese nationalists enter the North. Ho Chi Minh's reaction to this is worth mentioning. And I'll use polite terms, unlike the terms he used. He said, "I'd rather be licking the boot heels of the French than eating the dung of the Chinese." So, old feelings die hard. Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist, and as much as he hated the French, he really hated the Chinese. Because, of course, that animosity stretched back for centuries. Now, these arrangements, the Chinese nationalists are in the north, the British are sent in temporarily in the southern part of Vietnam, they're temporary. And despite the fact that Ho Chi Minh has actually issued a Vietnamese Declaration of Independence, and by the way, when he issued that Declaration of Independence in August of 1945, he quoted directly from the American Declaration of Independence. Partly for practical reasons, he wanted to gain the support of the Americans, whom he saw as a non-imperialist major power that might support Vietnamese independence at this time. But it also shows the wide circulation of ideas. We talk about globalization in the 20th century. Well, here's one small example of just how pervasive ideas were becoming, that no matter what culture happened to generate them, people across the globe were becoming familiar with all kinds of philosophical, political, intellectual concepts. The French are insistent that they return. And Ho Chi Minh can do little about that because despite the fact that the Viet Minh are an armed force, they can't possibly match the military power that the French can bring to bear. And eventually a return is negotiated, the French saying they're coming back to prepare Vietnam for independence, which no one, not even the French, really believed. The return of the French sets off a second guerrilla war as the Viet Minh take up arms against the French occupiers. And so do the nationalists, fighting the French just as they had both fought the Japanese before them. It becomes a long, drawn-out armed struggle. And the communists are particularly helped by the fact that after the Chinese Communist Revolution in 1950, China, which borders right on northern Vietnam, now becomes a source of weapons for the communists in Vietnam. Now again, we now have two communist powers, one in China, one in and the communist insurgents in Vietnam. But the Vietnamese still hated the Chinese. But it was a marriage of convenience. Meanwhile, the French are trying to reestablish essentially a version of the old colonial structure. They bring back the then puppet emperor, Bao Dai. And officially, he's supposed to be the governing authority of Vietnam, although everyone knows it's really the French, just as it has been for the past century. In fact, Bao Dai had had a rather torturous experience as emperor. The communists had threatened to kill him, so he had to leave Vietnam when they came in 1945. So he went to the Riviera, which he much preferred. Then the French threatened to cut off his stipend unless he went back to Vietnam, so he had to go back to Vietnam. But he really wasn't very interested in governing, and that was fine with the French because they really just wanted him as a figurehead. Meanwhile, in the South, some of the most difficult fighting is going on as well, because it is in the South in particular that most of the land has been lost by peasants, largely because there was more arable land in the South that could be taken by large landowners. So there's deep unrest in both North and South. Finally, in 1954, the French find themselves surrounded at an outpost in northern Vietnam called Dien Bien Phu. And their troops are forced to withdraw from that position. This was not total defeat. The French army hadn't been destroyed, but it might as well have been. The French public was increasingly fed up with this colonial war, and now, having to surrender this position to the Viet Minh, it became clear that the French people wanted an end to this war, and they wanted it quickly. In fact, a new prime minister was elected, guaranteeing that he would have France out of Vietnam within 6 months. To solve this problem of what to do about Vietnam, a peace conference is held in Geneva, Switzerland. It includes the great powers like the Soviet Union, the United States, and Britain, and of course the French. And eventually, a compromise is reached, a decision to partition Vietnam into two parts, North and South. The communists will take the North. The exact fate of the South is as yet undetermined. The interesting note here is that the Vietnamese communists, Ho Chi Minh in particular, felt that they deserved to take control of the entire country. I mean, they had defeated the French. The Americans were particularly resistant to that idea. And in the end, the Chinese intervened and said, well, let's petition the place. Something that Ho Chi Minh wanted to strangle them for. And he knew what the Chinese were up to. The Chinese did not want a unified and increasingly powerful Vietnam on their southern border. So partition was fine with them. It would leave the communists with only half a country. But they encouraged the Vietnamese and communists and told them, well, they could go on and continuing fighting the French. And Ho Chi Minh said, yeah, bill having us fighting to the last Vietnamese. So again, tensions were rather high despite the ideological identity between the Communist Party of Vietnam and that of China. The fate of the South was determined by the commitment of the United States, anxious to prevent the spread of communism, to support the leader of the nationalist cause in Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem had been living in exile for a number of years in the United States, but he was brought back, and the United States launched itself on a campaign that we'll become increasingly familiar with in the next few weeks of nation building. The United States saw itself as this beacon of achievement, representative democracy, capitalist economics, individualistic society, and it believed that it could replicate those institutions, those values, and those conditions in much of the world. And here was an opportunity to do precisely that. In a society which really didn't have an identity. It was the southern half of Vietnam, but there had been no nation of South Vietnam up until now. What there was of a government had always been in Hanoi. And there was a government up there already, the communist one. So here they were going to start from scratch. Build a military, build a government, build a society. Unfortunately, the Americans, and for that matter, Diem, the president of the South, came to focus more on security than on promoting democracy and participation of the larger population. This was inhibited in part by American concerns about communist insurgents. It was also true that Diem himself was not terribly fond of democracy. He was more inclined to be an autocrat. There was also a fundamental problem that Diem's supporters included the large landowners in South Vietnam. So he was unlikely to be able to satisfy the most persistent demand throughout the revolutionary process in Vietnam, and that was to redistribute land to the peasants. So it was going to be very difficult for him to earn widespread support in the South. Meanwhile, the communists were organizing and drawing into their political organization that they titled the National Liberation Front a variety of non-communist groups, including professional associations, peasant organizations. These weren't necessarily communist at all, but they did share the idea that, once again, nationalism was essential. They did not want to be dominated by the United States, and that there was great animosity towards Diem for a lack of participation in the political process, and even more importantly, a lack of land reform. The National Liberation Front, although largely political in its early configuration, soon emerges as an insurgent paramilitary organization, which the Americans termed the Viet Cong. Americans poured in billions of dollars of aid trying to suppress resistance to the Diem government. They sent thousands of American military advisors. But by 1963, even the Americans conceded that their hand-picked president of Vietnam was failing in his efforts to suppress the insurgency. Word was sent out to Vietnamese military leaders that, unlike the earlier American stance, which had warned Vietnamese generals against overthrowing the government, that now the Americans would not be averse to such a development. Very quickly, Diem was overthrown. The Americans expected him to be sent into exile. Instead, he was assassinated. The change of government only made things worse as one government succeeded another. As the country slipped further into chaos, the United States committed more than 500,000 troops to try to suppress the growing insurgency, which was now directly assisted by forces from the north. So Vietnam's resistance had entered a new stage. Moving past the resistance to the French, now a new era of resistance, armed resistance, now against the Americans, and this one designed to reunite North and South. The American initiative, well, it took, or I should say inflicted, heavy casualties upon the insurgents, became bogged down and unable to score a clear victory over the communists. In 1968, the communists launched a massive uprising, seizing a number of key locations in large urban centers. Eventually, the Americans were able to drive them out, but it also began convincing many Americans that the war was a lost cause, that after some 3 years, almost 4 years of intense American involvement militarily, there seemed to be little progress. And the United States soon turned towards a policy of Vietnamization, which meant reducing the American troop levels from 550,000 down to about 40,000, while supplying increased resources to the South Vietnamese military to fend off the insurgents. In 1974, an armistice is agreed to in Paris between the warring parties, particularly the Americans and the North Vietnamese. But only a year later, a new push by the communists led to the sudden collapse of the government in the South, and in 1975, Vietnam was reunited as a single nation under communist control. The case of Vietnam spans both the struggle against outright Western colonialism that we saw in India just now, and incorporates as well resistance by third world societies against what they saw as American domination in the aftermath of the collapse of Western colonialism. And this became a common pattern in much of the world in the 1960s, 70s, and into the 80s, that resistance shifted from fights against European imperial powers to armed uprisings against what was seen as American domination. The sources of that kind of resistance we can see here somewhat, but we'll look at more closely in the final sessions of the course as we look at the spread of American influence globally after World War II. But here we see, in two cases, the roots of the rapid decline of the old imperial order and of a rising sense of national identity among non-Western cultures and societies that had been subjugated for a century or more under European colonialism. It was one small indication that, as pervasive and dominant as the West had been for approximately a century, that dominance was rapidly receding, that the structures of colonialism, of total control over non-Western societies, politically, economically, culturally, was rapidly disintegrating. And it would only be another half century before the economic dominance of the West would be challenged as well by such former subjugated states as China and India. And we'll be looking at that process as well as we get into the later stages. In the next second half, we'll look at two other cases of national liberation against the old European colonial order.